Good evening and namaste, everyone. Welcome to the third session of Decoding the Idea of Communist China conference. I am Sneha Kathy Sebastian, a research associate with the forum. In this session, we will decode the Chinese economy and understand its various policies. The session chair is Professor V Yogananda, an honorary adjunct fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, New Delhi. She is also a distinguished senior fellow at DRAS, Kochi, India. She worked as the Dean of Social Sciences at Osmania University and Amity University between 2016 and 21. Ma'am has pursued her MPhil and Ph.D. from Osmania University, where she has also served as the head of Department of Political Science. At Amity University, she has been the Dean of Amity Institute of Social Sciences, International Studies, Defense and Strategic Studies, Public Policy, and Military College for Women. She was also the head of Amity Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies. The speakers for this session are Dr. Dattesh D. Parulekar, Assistant Professor of International Relations and Area Studies at the School of International and Area Studies, Goa University, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Lieutenant General C. A. Krishnan, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, and former Deputy Chief to the Army and a former member of the Armed Forces Tribunal. And finally, Mr. Balasubramanian C, Senior Research Officer, C3S, Head Media and Outreach and Program Director of Internships. I welcome all the speakers to this session. Now I request Professor V Yogananda to proceed with the session. Over to you, Ma.
Welcome to all the panelists. It gives me immense pleasure to chair this particular session. Though I'm not a known China expert, chairing comes naturally to us in the academic field. But I thank the Indic Research Forums for identifying me once again for doing this great job. I see a galaxy of panelists with in-depth knowledge of the subject. But as a chairperson of the session, good evening to all of you because I'm speaking from Canada. It's morning time here, good morning rather, it's evening for all of you in India, and for others, whatever is the day of the time of the day. At the outset, while the panel is supposed to discuss the economic issues related to China, each of us, I'm sure, needless to mention, is acutely aware of the fact that we have numerous reports about the growth trajectory of Chinese economy as well as the challenges that the Chinese economy faces. What we need to do in understanding China is to juxtapose different perspectives and in-depth studies, not just based on economic issues, but go into the other areas, strategic as well as other challenges that a country like China poses to the world rather than faces from the world. At the most, it is isolation that it faces because everybody feels threatened with the way the Chinese are coming out and talking about or conducting themselves, or the escalation dynamics that they put forth in front of the world is a scary scenario. So all the ganging up against them and several other developments that are taking place in contemporary politics needs to be addressed. I was extremely happy to see General Krishnan likely to talk about the rare earth elements, because the rare earth elements is the issue that is driving the Chinese modernization programs. Those of you who are familiar with Captain Kamlesh Agnihotri's latest book, which deals extensively with the kind of modernization of the Chinese military equipment that has been taking place based on disruptive technologies, is a phenomena in itself. So given those details, what is the Chinese economy likely to talk about and Chinese economy is likely to be? They have the largest chunk of middle classes at this point of time in history, surpassing the European record of middle classes. Europe is a small area. Comparatively, Chinese military or the demographic scale is vastly superior, and they have managed, by right means, wrong means is a philosophical debate, But to pull out so many millions and billions, and it is likely to touch by 2030, 1.4 billion is likely to be the middle class, according to predictions in the global published publications. So with this scenario, what is it that each of the speakers is likely to talk about is what should be interesting all the participants here. So with those few opening remarks, if I have time, I will come back with other comments. I think Dr. Parulekar is the first speaker. May I request
Yes.
you, sir, to kindly take the floor and give your presentation. Your time starts now.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. And let me at the outset compliment Indic Researchers Forum for putting together this seminal conference. It's my second opportunity on this platform, and it's a privilege to join distinguished panelists who are much more experienced and much more illustrious in their profession domains. The brief before me essentially is to talk to you about the Chinese economic model and how capitalist is it or is it not. Now, this is something that we are all intrigued by. Most things of China, as we've heard, are inscrutable and Byzantine. But at the same time, China also, through almost 4 decades of stellar economic growth, has been able to buck the trend and defy conventional myths. And this makes us essentially look up at the China model always with a certain degree of dichotomy. So there is a certain degree of skepticism that accompanies what happens in China. At the same time, it is tempered by a lot of awe and a lot of a kind of a shock about how China manages to do what it does. Now, before we get into the brass tacks of capitalism and how far is it a capitalist economy or not, let's look at how they have responded during COVID times on the economic front. While everybody has obsessed, and rightfully so, about how they have come out and done their wolf warrior diplomacy and bare-knuckled military posturing, what remains almost obscured is the kind of decisions which were announced by Xi Jinping through 2020. The first was when he came out and he doubled down on the commitment to operationalize a digital currency and to bring in a digital yuan. This will have important implications for futuristic applications because we are getting increasingly into financialization of services, and payment gateways are going to be very important. The second was the announcement that China was essentially going to now unleash or unlock the potential of Hainan Island, which was always seen from a military standpoint and always seen in the context of the South China Sea disputes. They were now going to unlock value on the Hainan Island by making the Hainan Island a free port economic zone. Now, this definitely, as and when it succeeds, if it does, over 3 phases, by 2035, is expected to change the landscape by which we look at maritime economies, and particularly islands playing their role within maritime economies. The third aspect is Xi Jinping announcing that they would actually now work very strenuously towards creating a technical standards initiative, which is again talking of basically standard setting and process setting, albeit in the technological space, but we understand that most technology aspects today are economic kind of propositions at their core. All of these are very important indicators of where China is looking to go. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what kind of an economy is China today, and whether what happened since 1978 to, let's say, 2013, which was essentially 35 years of stellar economic growth, was that an aberration, or what Xi Jinping is now doing in terms of trying to impose authoritarianism on the Chinese economy, the norm going forward? This is a fundamental question that has to be asked. Now, let's look at some of the important milestones in terms of China's economic progression. We all recognize very much of the depraved actions that happened between 1949 and 1976, which brought great misery on the Chinese population. And we've also seen since 1978 that when the world, and particularly developing economies, had not even woken up to the potential of what economic kind of liberalization can be, China actually was ambitiously bold to be able to set out a raft of economic reforms which were much earlier than their times. I mean, for China to put out special economic zones and to think and envision them back in 1978-79 was humongously pitching into the dark. Similarly, the ability to actually allow for certain degrees of privatizations, particularly the decollectivization of agriculture, was a very important point. And also the ability, as Ezra Vogel's book talks about, Deng Xiaoping and his persona, his fervent belief that the only way China could grow was if China engaged with the world and if Chinese were sent out into the world to be able to assimilate experiences. Now, I want to put two more recent kind of instances that hark back to what happened then. About 3 years ago, when Li Keqiang was in Singapore, he had no bones whatsoever in admitting in a public address that he made that China has always admired the Singapore model of Lee Kuan Yew. And in a sense, they have actually tried to emulate many virtues of Lee Kuan Yew. Now, this sits very comfortable with what Deng Xiaoping had publicly done in 1978, which was to send delegations of Chinese out to as many as 20 different countries, both in East Asia, in Europe, and the United States, to learn various experiences and to bring those experiences back so that they could actually then curate their own experience based on various economic development models that existed the world over. I also cast your mind to what happened in 2019-20. In India's economic survey, which is the document that precedes the budget, the chief economic advisor clearly outlined that, in his opinion, if India had to move to a higher growth rate of trajectory in terms of being able to deal with many of its legacy issues, we would have to, in large measure, replicate portions of the Chinese economic miracle. This comes out in the economic survey of India by no less than the chief economic advisor of the current government. And this happens in 2019-20. Now, this in the context of the fact that China has been able to bring about a lot of jobs for its people, which is able to keep pace with economic growth, while much of the developing world has struggled to be able to match up their economic growth with job creation. And that's why we have the phenomenon of jobless growth that seems to basically beset many economies around the world. So when you look at the Chinese model evolving, one has to look at how the past is quite so reminiscent with what is happening with the present. Fast forward to 1992, and the 14th Party Congress of China effectively for the first time declares China to be a market economy. This happens at a time when Francis Fukuyama has already declared the triumphalistic version that Western neoliberalism has won and will be the pervading economic doctrine of our times. But rarely did the West imagine that just 2 or 3 years after he had spoken about this and the Cold War was over, that China would actually declare itself to be a market economy as early as 1992. It's a different matter that China's progression since then has been more checkered in terms of being a market economy, but at least they pinpointed themselves to be a market economy. And then in 2001, when China joins the WTO, the logic was that China now integrating with the global trading architecture would only make China a market economy willy-nilly. And yet 21 years later, the track record of what China exudes is the fact that China has been able to cherry pick on what extent of integration it wants to do with global capitalism and to what extent it wants to maneuver itself in and out of its own definition of a market economy. So while China continues to talk of a market economy, China also continues to be a currency manipulator. China also continues to be able to leverage the fact that it is the largest trading partner of more than 125 countries in the world, and it's able to weaponize trade. In 2017, a very interesting incident happened. Even as Donald Trump chose not to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, a rarity for an American president not to go to the World Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum invites Xi Jinping to deliver the inaugural address. And that in itself was ironical. It was itself a changing times, because here is a country that has often defined itself to be socialism with Chinese characteristics, has been unapologetic about talking about its socialism, but has practiced capitalism in an efficient way such that the world now considers it necessary to be brought in to essentially deliver the inaugural address. And subsequently, Xi Jinping in 2018 at the Bao Forum for Asia, which is the equivalent of China's World Economic Forum, actually goes out and promises to the world that China will carry the burdens of capitalism. One, through importing more from the world and not only exporting to the world, but two, also through basically cleaning up and providing market reforms which will be liberal in the Chinese sense of the term. Yet what we have witnessed are 5 or 6 different trends. The first one is the amazing agility of the Chinese state to be able to adapt and to be resilient to challenges that emerge. In 2008, when the global economic and financial crisis struck, the logical view and the plausible view was that China would take the biggest hit, and the next decade or so would be essentially about China stumbling from crises to crises, because China's export-oriented economy was now going to face the headwinds from the slump that came from the global economic and financial crisis. And yet, unfortunately for us in the democratic world, the last 10 years has shown that China, far from being diffident, has actually got more assertive in economic terms and has in fact become more strategically externally oriented through many elements of its capitalist instrumentality. Trade remains such a big element of capital instrumentality. And today, not only is the fact that China the biggest exporter of the world, but the very fact that there are a huge number of economies today in the world, in Africa and Latin America in particular, whose economic destiny relies on how much China imports from them. So in a sense, what China has done is used elements of its capitalism to build transactional interdependence, to build transactional integration. It is not a symbiotic integration, because there are still elements where the world doesn't feel comfortable in coupling with China economically. But China, due to its scale of operation and the size of its demography, and as the Madam Chairperson talked about the rising middle class, is able to create a transactional kind of integration and interdependence that allows them to weaponize these instrumentalities whenever they prefer to do so. The second aspect is China's ability to reinvent itself. We have often talked about the fact that China is largely a one-trick pony. It's an export-oriented economy, and it is obviously going to see diminishing returns. It has quite clearly seen diminishing returns, but fortunately for it, it has also shown the ability to be able to reinvent itself. And we've seen that in terms of how external investments have now changed to domestic investment. In fact, a very interesting scenario is between 2 companies, Apple and Huawei. Both in their own right are good examples, shining examples of capitalism being practiced in United States and China. And yet both come across as very, very different entities. With Apple, it's a shining example of engineering, innovation, and what entrepreneurial spirit can do in terms of creating the ultimate product. But Huawei, which is now challenging Apple, also has its own challenges that face it. So while Apple faces the challenge of trying to stay relevant in the Chinese market, where of course twice the number of Apple phones it sells than it sells in the US, the Huawei challenge is to be able to now ensure that it has a steady supply of semiconductors and processor chips so that it can actually decouple from a dependence on the United States. So it tells you that there is a US version of capitalism and there is a Chinese version of capitalism. Many have called it state capitalism. Many have called it capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And I think there is a great deal of merit in that. Because China, in its current form today, wants to essentially dominate trading regimes. At a time when the world is moving into protectionism and everyone's looking to guard their turf, China seems to be wanting to lay out a message that it's open to do business in multilateral trading institutions. So it's almost in a sense taken control of the RCEP, which was an ASEAN-mooted concept, but now almost is seen as a kind of a China-driven concept. At the same time, it is confident enough to make the pitch to Japan and the likes of and the others that it would like candidature in the CPTPP. So China is showing the ability of not only being able to run with RCEP, which it dominates, but also move and try and seek candidature in a trade bloc that has been seen to be progressive and the champion of higher standards. When you look at the last 70 years, one of the big failings of the democratic and civilized world has been the inability to address some of the gaping problems that the world faces. And one of them has been infrastructure deficit. Why is it that every infrastructure initiative over the last 10 years that has cropped up in the democratic world is essentially a reaction to the Belt and Road Initiative? In fact, had the Belt and Road Initiative...
Dr. Parulekar, you have
Yes?
4 minutes.
Yes, okay. So if the Belt and Road Initiative had not come about, would we have seen the proliferation of various networks of connectivity, infrastructure, and otherwise, which would have emerged in the international community? Possibly not. They have all risen because we see the threat posed by the Belt and Road Initiative to small countries, to the overall issue of connectivity. And therefore, this is another element of capitalist instrumentality which China is able to use. The third aspect is the ability of its market. While everyone talks about how China weaponizes elements against other countries, most notably tourism, and it's done that to Maldives, it's done that to South Korea on various issues, the point remains the Chinese market is the most understudied and the most understated element of China's economy. It is that element that keeps South Korea from going all out against the United States, because South Korea would like to see its semiconductor industry, companies at some level tie up with Chinese companies so that they're able to access the Chinese market. And despite of Japan having searing, issues with China, even Japan seems to be in a on the economic front in a kind of a inchoate state where it's not quite able to make up its mind whether its future lies in decoupling totally from China or in some degree of checkered coupling. So this element also needs to be studied. Couple more points need to be made about China's capitalist model. And one is the disparity between SOEs and private firms. Now, an argument is always made that Xi Jinping has come down hard because he would like to go back to the Mao era. He's somebody who has a disdain for private wealth, where Deng Xiaoping once said, to be rich is to be glorious. Xi Jinping is believed to have said, excessive opulence runs amok, and I'm going to control them. But I think the very fact that he's had to double down and had to assert his control on certain companies in the financial sector and the tech sector tells us clearly that there was capitalism at play. So when people argue that there has never really been the kind of capitalism that we associate with the West, if these companies were simply appendages of the Communist Party, he would not necessarily have to come down hard on them. The very fact that he has come down hard on them clearly shows us that there is a predatory authoritarian form that is now trying to impose itself on the natural logic of capitalism. The last point that I would make essentially is about how does the Chinese state look at the entire scenario. And quite clearly, the legitimacy of the Chinese party is very important. There was a time during Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao's period when technocrats were making it into the CCP. And in fact, there was a talk, in fact, Wen Jiabao had once commented that probably the model that ultimately China will arrive at is something like the Singaporean model, where you essentially have a one-party state, but an elected one-party kind of state. It will be in power, but it will still open up and modernize. Apart from that, the corruption which came into being allowed Xi Jinping to be able to curb many of these sectors. But it's clear that the SOEs are getting a pass at the expense of the private sector. And that is why the ultimate point that needs to be made about China's economic model is that it remains a complex model. There continue to be elements of socialism because that is key to the longevity of the political existence of the oldest Communist Party in power till now. And at the same time, there is a move towards capitalism, which is seen in private enterprise, which is seen in the market power of the consumers, which is seen in the rising demography in the middle class of China. But Chinese policy sits somewhere in the middle. And that middle is a third way, which is neither outright socialism nor outright capitalism. It's a checkered form of both that provides Xi Jinping to be both a Mao Zedong and a Deng Xiaoping going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for adhering to the time. I appreciate it a great deal, and your comments too. May I now request Professor Nagy to go on with his presentation?
Thank you very much to the INDIC Research Group for hosting this session. I am deeply appreciative of the invitation to share my thoughts. And I think it's wonderful that you're speaking from Canada, Jyotsna, and I'm a Canadian speaking in Tokyo. With that, I'd like to address my presentation and guess the key theme is looking at the endogenous and exogenous factors that are affecting the BRI sustainability. And I think this is an important way, our previous speakers' depiction of the Chinese economy is an important starting point for this discussion. In terms of the structure of today's discussion, what I'd like to do is talk about China's strengths. And I think it does have strengths despite some of the declining benefits of those strengths. Second, I want to focus on the new realities that are facing the Chinese economy and how this will ultimately affect its viability and sustainability over the mid to long term. And lastly, look at how these are affecting the BRI and what are some of the alternative or I guess exogenous factors that are affecting both the Chinese economy and the sustainability of the BRI. So with that, I think that strengths of the Chinese economy are quite simple, and we've seen the strengths up here at this particular junction in Chinese history. The political calendar shapes the decision-making of leaders, and we know that next in the fall of this year will be the 20th Party Congress, and in the spring of 2023 will be the National People's Congress. And both of these are significant events in terms of consolidating Xi Jinping's position moving forward, likely installing his men and women at the Standing Committee, the Politburo, and the Central Committee. And all this will impact China's ability to deliver or at least stabilize the economy to a degree that helps mitigate some of the structural challenges that is being faced, but also the geopolitical challenges associated with the US-China strategic competition. Second, I think very importantly, and this was touched upon again by our previous speaker, is the asymmetric dependence that exists between China and most of its neighbors. Let me give you an example. Last year, Japan exported about $210 billion of products to China. This is despite record unfavorable ratings. We have a similar figure with South Korea, Australia, many Southeast Asian countries, and even my home country, Canada, despite unfavorable ratings associated with the arrest of the two Canadians, we continue to deepen our trade relations with China. This suggests that China's comparative advantages benefit our countries, and that these comparative advantages are not going to disappear anytime soon. In this sense, I think that China does have some comparative strengths that will help it manage the challenges associated with demographics moving forward. But at the same time, there's many realities that are facing the Chinese economy today. Demographics, of course, is one. The 4-to-1 problem with 4 grandparents being supported by 2 parents and 1 child is an important example of that, but also the unbalanced growth. And when we make a comparison, for example, of the service sector of for example, Australia versus China. Australia has about 70% of its employees working in high-quality service sectors. South Korea is about 85%. Japan is about 96%. And what I mean is these are the Apple kind of jobs, high-paying, high-quality, really to have a middle-class lifestyle that allows for consumption and savings. But when we drill down into the Chinese economy, these figures are really somewhat more complicated. 2019 figures, and I think that's probably shifted a little bit, showed that about 56% of the Chinese economy is a service sector based economy. But of that 56%, really only about 20% are high paying service sector jobs. And the rest would be what we would consider in Canada Walmart kind of service sector jobs. So low paying, not really sustainable life for a life, especially in large cities like Nanjing or Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou. These are expensive cities to live in. And if you have a service sector job that is low paying, you're going to be struggling. And I think if you've been following any of the migrant workers' plights in the Shanghai lockdown, they have been incredible stories about the struggles of the average Chinese being affected by the lockdown. We also have other challenges in terms of the Chinese economy, and this has to do with productivity. It has to do with declining rates of productivity, increased role of state-owned enterprises in the economy, and how this affects productivity. And of course, Xi Jinping's recent announcement of common prosperity, which places a much larger role in the state economy. These new realities are creating challenges in terms of economic stability, and of course, these are exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, the dynamic zero approach to minimizing COVID spread in China, but also the recent Ukraine-Russian conflict, which is disrupting supply chains and food, which is going to further put downward pressure on the Chinese economy in the short to midterm, and likely cause foreign firms to start to think to Southeast Asia and South Asia as not to decouple from China, but find alternatives to build stability into their supply chains. Now, with these questions in mind, those are largely endogenous factors that I think are going to affect the sustainability of the BRI moving forward. But importantly, there's other exogenous factors that are related to, I think, the trajectory of the BRI and how much the BRI can expand in the future. First and foremost is financial uncertainties. When we're talking about financial uncertainties, we're talking about fiscal transparency, environmental sustainability, as well as debt sustainability. And what we've seen is a growing number of countries understand the challenges associated with non-legalistic, non-binding, and often secretive agreements through the BRI, which is creating less buy-in in terms of countries jumping into the BRI. They understand that there's challenges. They are sensitive to so-called debt trap diplomacy that some countries have experienced. And I would like to re-emphasize that most research suggests that the debt trap diplomacy is mostly misinformation rather than a real solid track record of debt trap diplomacy, with Sri Lanka being an exception. Further downward pressure on the BRI and the Chinese economy in general, of course, is alternatives to the BRI. And here we see many alternatives moving forward to really make the BRI as a signature initiative of the Chinese either less competitive or less attractive to recipient countries. Here I'm talking about, I'll give you several examples. The first and foremost is the free and open Indo-Pacific concepts that are really being spearheaded by Japan, but also Australia, the United States, and to a certain degree, India. Now, this free and open Indo-Pacific vision or concept at its heart really focuses now on infrastructure connectivity, trade and development, and providing good governance and transparent institutions. These are important ways to build stability into the political economy of the Indo-Pacific countries. And I think that they see these institutions as an alternative to the BRI, but also a way to get, as we say, get the milk from all the cows in the region. In this sense, they understand that by engaging with the free and open Indo-Pacific, they can get better conditions on the BRI. A second good example is the Regional Supply Chain Initiative. And here again, India, Australia, and Japan have worked together to broaden the investment and focus on economic security through the region by selectively diversifying supply chains within the region. Now, this is as much about economic security for the benefactors of the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, but also thinking about how these initiatives can benefit Southeast Asia and South Asia. Furthermore, we have also memorandums of understandings of business cooperation. And a really good example of that, of course, is the U.S. Trade Development Agency, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade, and Japan's Bank for International Cooperation. They signed a memorandum of understanding in terms of providing private funding for infrastructure, energy, and natural resource sectors in third countries. Again, this is meant to provide alternatives to the BRI and to ensure that recipient states have many different opportunities to engage in development through infrastructure connectivity by many different actors. The quadrilateral security dialogue that was mentioned by Professor Sato in his presentation also has shifted towards or away from a purely securitarized maritime security focus to talk about supply chains, talk about technology, talk about infrastructure connectivity. And this is another alternative to the BRI, which I think will create more opportunities. And this is a competition or a market for competition of different ideas. Lastly, but not least, in terms of alternatives to the BRI, is the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainability, Connectivity, and Quality Infrastructure. This is meant to, again, provide infrastructure throughout the region as an alternative to the BRI, so that states have choices rather than being put or joining the BRI because of the attractiveness of the conditions. Now, these are already existing alternatives to the BRI, and I think that they will limit the BRI moving forward. But we also have other important initiatives that have emerged over the past year. And in particular, these are what we call the economic security bills that have emerged out of the United States and Japan. In the case of Japan, they have the so-called Economic Security Promotion Bill, which was been discussed since January 2022, and it's come into law in April 2022. And we also have the American Competes Act. Both of these are meant to provide a platform and to really stall the momentum of the Chinese BRI and its sustainability. And they're doing this, of course, through strengthening supply chains, promoting public-private partnerships, through multilateral financing and environmental sustainability initiatives in infrastructure, strengthening infrastructure against cybersecurity, and providing alternative financial instruments to, again, compete with China's infrastructure bank. And this is, I think, important indications that partners such as Japan and the United States are very serious about competing with the BRI and ensuring that the BRI is not sustainable as a tool and or shape the BRI so it's more transparent, more fiscally sustainable, and free of geopolitical initiatives. My third area that I think will continue to shape the BRI is, and China's policies moving forward, of course, is Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And I understand different countries define what's happened in Ukraine differently. I will specifically use the term invasion of Ukraine. I think, and with that, I think that the actions by Russia has fundamentally disrupted China's initiative for the BRI in Eastern Europe. It's going to affect supply chains in terms of food, in terms of nickel, in terms of fertilizers, and this is going to further complicate the Chinese economy domestically in terms of food security and energy security, but it's going to complicate and create new choices or cause new choice or create new pressures to cause countries to make different choices about joining China's BRI. I think, importantly, I think it raises questions in the Chinese sphere is how feasible is BRI expansion into so-called Russia's spheres of influence. Here I'm speaking about South Central Asia. There are real questions if Mr. Putin is not happy about the influence of the West in Eastern Europe. He may not be equally as happy about Chinese influence in South Central Asia. Important in thinking about the sustainability of the BRI and how this is related to exogenous factors, of course, is balancing strategic autonomy and opportunity. It's clear that the BRI provides opportunities for many countries through Southeast Asia, South Asia, and South Central Asia. But at the same time, there are questions about strategic autonomy. What does it mean if you are signing memorandums of understandings that can't be disclosed to the public? And here, what we see is whether it's in South Central Asia or Latin America or even in Africa, what we see is many countries having increasingly concerns about how the BRI may affect their strategic autonomy and the choices they make vis-a-vis China on important issues related to their community. And here I'm specifically thinking about a code of conduct in the South China Sea, but also thinking about South Central Asia, South Asia, and even in African countries of how they manage environmental issues, good governance issues, etc. Lastly is trust. And I think this is probably the last factor that, or last, but it's not exhaustive list, that is really affecting the sustainability of the BRI and really using the BRI to expand China's geoeconomic influence throughout the region. And here, whether it's the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies Survey or the Asian Power Index or the Asian Barometer, or even studies by Shigeto Sonoda looking at how Japan and Korea and other Southeast Asian countries view China, what we see is that the BRI projects are primarily seen by elites as positive, but by ordinary citizens as problematic, or at least the goods associated with the BRI going to the elites rather than the ordinary individuals. So trust is another important factor in the sustainability of the BRI. And if the BRI is not sustainable in terms of promoting China's geoeconomic strategic interests, we have real challenges moving forward. So in short, I just want to return to, I guess, my core argument. There's really endogenous and exogenous factors affecting the BRI sustainability. China has strengths, its political system, and of course its asymmetric relationships with its neighbors, but it has structural issues associated with its economy, whether it's demographics, unbalanced growth, and that exogenous factors, again, such as alternative institutions, the economic security bills out of the United States, the invasion of Russia, these ideas of balancing strategic autonomy and opportunity and trust are all downward pressures on the BRI and China's interest in using its economy to expand its geoeconomic interests in the region. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You finished ahead of your scheduled time. Thank you very much. I wish you touched upon the 4-ocean theory. I don't call it 2-ocean theory. The Chinese want all of Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific Ocean, but not the west coast of United States, Arctic as well as the Antarctic, and their debt trap hopefully will not end up as swapping of debts for the sovereignty of nation states. And they have in the trap very tiny states, which are nation states as per United Nations record, but then with no wherewithal to stand the behemoth Chinese economy. So I hope it doesn't mean relocation of the Chinese sovereignty and suzerainty over many parts of the globe. Very well. General Krishnan is the next speaker. Sir, I invite you to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Jyotsna. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Since you're in different parts of the world, I'm not saying only good evening, and greetings to you all wherever you are. It's a pleasure being part of this program and to be in the company of such a wonderful set of panelists, and in particular the wonderful chair that we have in Professor Jyotsna. I thank the INDIC Forum to start with for giving me this opportunity. Considering the centrality of China in the global affairs and its far from cordial relations with India, disaggregating and dissecting every facet of the country to understand the how, why, and what of China's actions is extremely important. I compliment the organizers for the manner in which the webinar has been structured. And ladies and gentlemen, I shall be speaking on the global rare earth industry with particular reference to China. I propose to start by giving an overview of rare earth and its importance. And thereafter, we will briefly trace China's rare earth supply chain monopoly and follow it up by giving an Indian perspective. Rare earths comprises 17 elements. These are the 2 elements of scandium, yttrium, and the 15 lanthanides elements, which include neodymium, dysprosium, and samarium. Rare earths are found sprinkled across the globe in very small concentrates. They are found mixed together with other deposits, including radioactive elements like uranium and thorium, which makes their extraction a little difficult. And one very peculiar thing about rare earths is rare earths per se are not rare, really. In fact, thulium, which is the least abundant rare earth, is about 200 times more abundant than gold. What really makes rare earths rare is the difficulty in finding them in adequate concentration to be economically extracted. Their extraction involves a complex separation process, and there are significant environmental challenges also. So before we proceed any further, let's take a look at the annual rare earth production and thereafter the assessed global deposits, which also is referred to as the reserve deposits. Here it is. In 2021, the global production of rare earths was about 280,000 metric tons, and about 60% of this came from China, about 15 from US, and the rest, as shown, about 1% each came from India and Russia. Coming to the assessed rare earth deposits, that is what is known as the reserve deposits, which is actually a nature's gift. Here again, we find that China has the largest share of about 35%. India has about 6%, and others as shown here. Now, from whatever little we have seen so far, and what I have shown you about the facts and figures, the basic facts and figures about rare earth, there is something very unique about the size of the rare earth industry, the global rare earth industry. 280,000 metric tons annually is a very small quantity compared with most other minerals. Just imagine the biggest cargo ocean liners in service today can move double this quantity in a single lift. That was as far as the quantity goes. Let's take a look at the upstream raw material value of rare earths. The annual upstream rare earth raw material production, annually is about $6 billion. Now let's compare this with the revenue of top 40 global mining companies. In 2019, it was a whopping $700 billion. So what we see is, whether it is the quantity or the upstream raw material cost, the value and the quantity does not appear very significant. What is it then that makes rare earth so critical that we are talking about it and everybody is, sitting up and taking note of what China is doing about the rare earth? That is because, ladies and gentlemen, rare earth forms an essential ingredient and is the performance enhancer which is used in downstream modern high-tech industries worth trillions of dollars. And as of now, it is irreplaceable. There is no substitute for it. And rare earths is also referred to as vitamins of chemistry. Now, the spectrum of rare earth use in industries is so vast. I've just listed out some here. Fighter jets to ballistic missiles, electronic display units, lasers, sonars, communication system, GPS, automobile industry, mobile phones, computer hard drives, catalysts, jewelry. The list is really speaking endless. We also use rare earths. They also find their use in nuclear reactors, in control rods and neutron absorbers, and are also critical in almost every green technology application like electric vehicles, wind turbines, and LED lighting. The single largest use, ladies and gentlemen, of rare earths today is for making lightweight, powerful, miniature rare earth permanent magnets, which has universal application across all strategic and defense applications. Now, with this as the backdrop, let's take a look at China's journey towards rare earth supply chain monopoly. How did they actually secure a monopoly in it? It's very instructive in understanding how China operates in such issues. Till the 1980s, United States was the predominant global rare earth supplier. Within just a decade, from 1990 to about 2000, through some fair but mostly unfair means China established total monopoly, not just in raw material, but across the entire rare earth supply chain. How did China really do this? Till the 1980s, Mountain Pass mines in California were the main source of rare earths in the world. It was supplying almost 85% to the world. But operating at its full capacity in the 90s, the Mountain Reserve facility produced almost 850 gallons of waste tailings every minute. Now, this waste tailings had a severe problem. It contained radioactive thorium and uranium. Now, dealing with this waste was a big problem. The mining firm, Molycorp, was ordered by the state of California to clean up this waste, and Molycorp found it impossible to store the waste, clean it up, and run an economically viable rare earth venture. And therefore, by 2002, the mine had to be closed down. While this was happening in the United States, China increased its rare earth production in a big way. Chinese rare earth producing firms were given huge state subsidy, and also, without any doubt, they overlooked a large number of environmental concerns to make the Chinese rare earth production facilities churn out rare earths. And China started exporting rare earths at predatory prices, far below the actual cost of production. Mines in the United States and elsewhere were unable to sustain against the Chinese rare earths and went actually out of business. The impact was actually very swift and dramatic. Within just 20 years, China went from producing less than 1/3 to nearly all of world's supply of rare earths. Now, China did not stop at it. They followed this up, the monopoly in the upstream raw material, by similar predatory policy for securing monopoly in the downstream rare earth value chain also. Industries manufacturing rare earth components were arm twisted to shift their facilities to China and later share their technology in exchange for assured raw material supply. And China, ladies and gentlemen, now is on an aggressive drive to acquire mineral resources around the world. As early as 1992, Deng Xiaoping had said, there is oil in the Middle East, but rare earths in China, and China must make the best use of its rare earth resources. And there is no doubt that's exactly what the Chinese did. Through relentless and systematic efforts, by 2012, China had attained the unassailable position as the global rare earths leader. Ladies and gentlemen, China now controls not only the upstream raw materials, but also production of the key intermediaries that go into a vast array of high-tech growth industries. Now, what does it mean? It means for countries that depend on China for upstream and intermediary rare earth products, China's monopoly poses a major worry. It hinders their capacity to compete with China, especially in all those industries which require these inputs, which we have seen is a huge spectrum. It is relevant to remember how China actually used its rare earth export and banned the rare earth exports to hold the Japanese to ransom in 2010 over the Senkaku Island issue. The bottom line is, China has the largest rare earths upstream resource base, which again is a nature's gift, but it has managed to establish monopoly over its downstream value chain, almost the entire downstream value chain also. The extent of the global dependence on China, even for strategic and defense application, is alarming. In 2013, the US realized that for every F-35 fighter aircraft, 400 kg of rare earth material was sourced from China. And the case was not too different for their warships, not even for the frontline submarines. Take a look at the mobiles. There are 7 billion devices in service in use today. The numbers are expected to cross 8 billion in a decade or so. all of them require a little bit of rare earth. Coming to renewable energy segment, that is another segment which is heavily dependent on rare earths. Now, when you talk of renewable energy, let's take a look at the wind energy first. You know, a typical 3 megawatt wind turbine requires about 2 tons worth of rare earth permanent magnets, ladies and gentlemen, each turbine. And the next thing that comes to one's mind when you talk about the renewable energy is the solar energy. Now, solar panels do not require rare earth, but I will still touch upon some very interesting facts and figures about solar panels and the solar energy production, because that would highlight, the Chinese hold on the entire spectrum of the renewable energy segment. Just a minute. There we are. More than 70% of the solar panels, the photovoltaic modules, are produced in China. And if you trace the trajectory, the manufacturing trajectory that China followed, it was no different from what it did in case of the rare earths. Here it is. The white line depicts the Chinese manufacturing curve, and the blue one, which you find at the bottom, hugging the bottom, is the United States solar panel manufacturing over the years. So around 2005, if you notice, you'll find both the countries produced almost the same amount. But thereafter, you will find the white line almost on a vertical takeoff. And just within about 10 to 15 years, by the year 2020, China was manufacturing about 300,000 megawatt a year worth of solar panels. And in the same year, the United States produced about 13,000 to 15,000 megawatt solar panels. So just see the monopoly that China has built, not only on the renewable energy sources which use rare earth, but along the entire spectrum. Now, while speaking, since we are speaking about renewable energy and we are doing all this exercise to get a sense of how does it relate to India, India's installed capacity for the renewable energy today is about 103 gigawatt, and our vision for 2030 involves a huge jump in the solar generation from 51 today to 300 gigawatt, and solar from 40 to 140 gigawatt. Now, let's take the scenario of electric vehicles, which also finds a place when you're talking about renewable energy. Now, I have listed out here the main components of a rare earth electric vehicle, and I will touch only on the first one. That's the main electric motor and the generator, which is the heart of the electric vehicle, which is actually the engine of the electric vehicle. Now, this cannot do without rare earths, because the powerful, lightweight, compact rare earth permanent magnets are a must for the electric vehicle, electric motors. The rest, there are about, apart from the main motor, there are about 25 other motors, catalytic converter, component sensors, LED screens. All of them in the electric vehicle require rare earths. Now, what is India's vision for electric vehicles? It's very interesting, and it also gives us, a sense of the problem that we would be facing. We have about 200 million 2- and 3-wheelers, about 40 million 4-wheelers, and about 1.5 million buses on road today. These numbers are set to double by 2030. And our vision for going electric by 2030 is 80% of all our 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers, 70% commercial vehicles, commercial cars, 30% private cars, and about 40% of our buses. Now, you can visualize the significance of rare earths for India as we go forward. We've seen the criticality of rare earths for the entire spectrum of modern high-tech industries. I just highlighted the renewable energy segment a little more because that is of a great concern as we go forward.
And
And
Krishnan, you have 4 minutes, sir.
okay, and the rare earth supply risk that is evident that it poses. All these industries face very high supply risk. Now, having seen the risk, is the world waking up? And the answer is yes. If you see the UK, they have set up, facilities in cooperation with Australia, resources coming from Tanzania. Similarly, another resource being set up about rare earth separating facility, resources coming from Angola. And a permanent magnet project is being set up with the help of a company called LCM London, Less Common Metal. Just incidentally, this is an India-owned company. EU again is proceeding a flurry of actions for producing rare earth permanent magnets. Same for EU and US combined, they are making monazite based. This is of interest to India because India's main rare earth resources are monazite based. US processing facility in cooperation with Australia, Mountain Pass has been reactivated. A permanent magnet project has been started off, and they have passed a Defense Act which bans the use of Chinese rare earth material in all their defense products. Canada is also into rare earth processing. Australia and Japan are already well up in the technology. India seems to be missing in action, ladies and gentlemen. Now, with considering the seriousness with which countries like US, Australia, Japan, Canada, and all these countries have taken up the challenge, it is likely that within a matter of about a decade or so, they will all establish an alternative rare earth supply chain. The opportunity to be an important player in the global rare earth supply chain may be just slipping out of India's hand unless we act fast. Because once the supply chain is established, it will be very difficult for us to enter it. To understand what India is up against, we need to see where India is now, where we are headed, and what does it imply in the rare earth context. I will request the chair for 2-3 minutes extra, madam. Here is our GDP trajectory. As on today, ladies and gentlemen, our GDP in nominal terms is about 3.3 trillion, which translates to about 11 trillion in terms of PPP. And in 2030, you can see that we are on track to raise it to 19.5 trillion, 2040, 30 trillion, and 2050, 44 trillion. These assessments are not Indian governments. These are by recognized world bodies. Now, if that be the trajectory of our GDP in the coming decades, it's important to see certain other economic indicators also. Now, the first two columns of the figures are for our total energy consumption and total carbon emissions. We are already up there, third in the world, as far as energy consumption and carbon emission goes. But please take your eyes to the next four figures. These are per capita figures: GDP, electricity consumption, energy consumption, and carbon emission. We are at the rock bottom. So what it indicates is that we have a long way to go on the growth trajectory at a very fast pace. We have no alternative but to adopt efficient, modern, high-tech industries and green technologies. And we have already seen the rare earth supply risk to these industries. With that as the backdrop, let's just see where we are as far as rare earth is concerned. Ladies and gentlemen, we have adequate rare earth resources in the form of monazites, that is beach sand minerals, but sadly it remains unexploited. And only the PSUs are permitted to mine this because of our regulations and categorizing this as beach sand mineral. We have no downstream rare earth industry worth the name, and we remain, despite being an early starter, we remain a low value downstream material supplier. That too of a very small quantity, just about 1%, as we've already seen. Now, realization of the China factor and the related supply risk has opened a window of opportunity for India. we have huge benefits. We have adequate rare earth resources in the form of monazite deposits, which I mentioned already, beach sand minerals, which also has an advantage of making it economical mining, because integrated exploitation of heavy minerals like ilmenite, zircon, garnet, rutile, etc. can be done with that. Private players and foreign partners are very eager with technology and financial support to set up facilities in India. There is realistic potential in India for producing rare earth permanent magnets in just about 2 to 3 years. That is almost zero gestation period. All that we need to do is to exploit our monazite route for production of rare earth and open monazite mining and facilitate setting up of rare earth supply chain by permitting private players and foreign partners into India's rare earth mining, monazite mining, and setting up rare earth industries. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Dr. Balasubramanian, you're welcome to start your presentation.
Thank you, distinguished Chair. Namaste, respected veterans from the armed forces, distinguished Chair, distinguished fellow panelists, distinguished members from academia, and young researchers, a warm greetings and good evening. I thank the organizers, Indic Researchers Forum, and the Chennai Center for China Studies, and a special thanks to Commodore R.S. Vasan, Commodore Vijesh Garg, and Commodore Deshmukh for their support and opportunity. With these words, I would like to get into my presentation. First, I would like to give a small prelude of my topic. As we all know, today China is dubbed as the factory of the world because China being an integral part of the supply chain due to it being a host of products, of several products and brands, from manufacturing simple products such as toys to complex goods such as automobiles. All are dependent on China some way or the other for their end products or for any of the components for which they need to manufacture. During the course of the pandemic and post the pandemic, what we see today is a reconstruction of the global supply chain. But strangely, this is being premised not on, not just being on the concepts of economic efficiency facilitated by globalization, but rather today it is being now dictated by geopolitics. As we all know, due to globalization, all the global supply chains today have evolved based on specific economic advantages of different countries, where it has contributed to placing diverse set of supply networks in several other countries. And as a result of which today we understand that today economic efficiency alone is no longer a driver of the supply chain. To quickly give you a brief outline, today my presentation will touch upon the 4 key tenets. One would be I would like to explain on the geopolitically driven efforts to how supply chains are being reoriented. I'll also reflect on the dominant position that China today enjoys in the global value chain and what is the character of supply chain, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will also touch upon how geopolitics has today become to play a major driver of such networks, and what are the economic fundamentals that aligns with the geopolitical push that is happening. Today, China, as I already mentioned, maintains a very dominant position because today Chinese manufacturing accounts for nearly 29% of all global manufacturing goods as of 2019. This has led to the ubiquitous tagline "Made in China," which has been ingrained in every major market, earning the nation's nickname. China earning the nickname being the world's factory. Over the last year, China has also become part of the largest trade bloc in history, covering 30% of the world's GDP, because of which it's signing the regional comprehensive economic partnership along with 14 other countries in the Southeast Asia. It also finalized a major deal with Iran. As of 2021, China was also one of the first countries to quickly come out of the pandemic in comparison with other countries. In the first quarter of 2021, its exports grew by almost 50% compared to previous year's quarter, which rose to around 710 billion. So this slide will tell you what has been the estimated losses on other countries which are dependent on China by just a mere 2% reduction in the Chinese intermediate export. As we can see from the slide, the European Union will lose around close to 15.6 billion if there is any kind of disruption in the global value chain caused by China. And the United States also tend to lose 5.8 billion. Japan stands to lose at 5.2 billion. So this is just to show what will be the global effects of China's slowdown because of the dominant position that it enjoys in the global value chain. And we also should understand China today holds the second highest GDP in the world. It also exports around 50% of all the world's goods. Next to China, only the US and Germany can come close to its share of global exports, but that too sitting at less than 10%, at 8.1% and 7.8% respectively. And this data is according to UNCTAD, retrieved as on 6th April 2021. And now I would like to touch upon the trade war and the pandemic aspects. So speaking of global value chain, today the buzzword today is all about decoupling. Today we all, when we speak of decoupling, what we actually mean is that we mean about the diversification of supply chain. Basically, this is not something that has started only with the onset of pandemic. There has always been there even before the pandemic, but thanks to the pandemic, it has accelerated the process. So basically, what happened? We all know the trade war which started between the US and China in 2018. It led to countries first starting with the United States to contemplate on reducing their dependency on China. And as a consequence, what happened was both the countries, US and China, they imposed on each other, slapped on each other high trade barriers, which got ramified, which affected several economies across the globe, which also exposed vulnerabilities of investments concentrating on one country like China, which means all countries realize that it's bad to put all your eggs in one basket. So as a result, many companies started to follow, they adopted the policy of China plus one, so as to hedge their risk. And what basically this China plus one strategy means is that all countries will focus on diversification by having one factory in China and another factory in some developing country in Southeast region like say Thailand or Vietnam, so as to bet their risk against China. So start with Taiwan took the lead. In 2019, Taiwan passed a law which encouraged the firms to build what it terms as a non-threat supply chain outside of China. Taiwan offered cheap finance, tax breaks, and simpler administration system to invest in its territory. There was an interesting study which was done by the Japanese investment bank Nomura, which found that between April 2018 to April 2019, it found that 56 companies had already shifted their bases out of China. So what happened was the onset of the pandemic had only intensified the discourse and accelerated the process to shift the companies and factories out of China so as to diversify their global supply chain. And speaking of Japan, in April 2020, Japan had already earmarked $2.2 billion to fund its firms to help them move out of China. So this basically came in the backdrop of Chinese imports to Japan dipping by half in Feb 2020 because of the pandemic, and Japanese manufacturer they were in a very dire need of components for their manufacturing. Just to give you a glimpse of the amount of losses that was caused, the initial supply chain shocks because of the Wuhan lockdown, it wiped out close to 50 billion of global exports in Feb 2020 alone. And the concomitant, the subsequent worldwide lockdown drove the global trade to plunge to a low of 27% year on year in the second quarter of 2020. This was even worse than what happened during the financial crisis of 2008, according to the UNCTAD report. Despite all these, China is still able to hold its ground because of the deep supply chain networks that are able to play by the rules of market. And we'll see why China holds such an advantage. So looking at the factors, what China enjoys by having the advantages. The first one, all Rome was not built in a day. So same way China, was not placed in the map being the manufacturing hub in one fine day. It all started 3 decades of, planned hard work. And by the 1990s, China was already the manufacturing hub of the world, and it hasn't looked back since. China became synonymous to manufacturing. It also earned the nickname, what we already mentioned, the world's factory. It was due to several factors. One is China's availability, the vast availability of land and quality labor, which was also low cost. Several technological advancements that was happening in China. The cost of production, the overall cost of production was also low, and the policies were also favorable. There was very scant regard for environmental regulations. As we all know, many of the polluting industries are placed in China. And China's strategic use of state-owned enterprises, because all the strategic sectors like artificial intelligence, all the technological sectors come under the state funding. The Chinese government gives them generous funding through state funding. Protectionist trade barriers are there to protect them. And also China uses its diplomatic muscle to capture markets and carefully craft and develop the homegrown competitors in advanced sectors. And one significant advantage which I would like to show through this map here is that China also enjoys a significant geographic advantage, and because of which there are tight integration of a vast ecosystem of suppliers, most of them in East Asia. Let me just give you a small glimpse of a complicated system like an iPhone. As you can see here, all is not manufactured in one place. You can see the number of production facilities for iPhone in China is 381. And apart from China, apart from the US, all the countries like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, all are in the close proximity and vicinity of China. And this is what I actually, meant by the geographical advantage and the tight integration into the vast ecosystem of suppliers that China enjoys. Next, I would like to speak on the Chinese equation and where does it stand in terms of its global dominance. So as we all know, today's the integrated modern world, we are very deeply integrated, which also presents significant opportunity for a country like China to use methods like economic coercion. And China is not something new. It has long tended to employ trade coercion in its dealing with other countries. The most notable one was in Japan during 2010 because of the Senkaku Island dispute in East China Sea, where China cut the supplies of rare earth materials. And at several times in history, coercive trade measures were taken against Philippines in 2012, Taiwan, which faced backlash against by China in 2016, South Korea in 2017, and the most recently and notable one was the Chinese actions against Australia in 2020. If you look into all these Chinese actions, the Chinese playbook, none of these Chinese coercive actions were imposed to achieve any kind of domestic economic objective, but rather they were actually imposed as a need to respond to the foreign policy positions which are taken by the other countries. So I would like to give you a most notable example, the recent one being Lithuania. What happened was, Lithuania allowed Taiwan consular access in its territory, which led to anger China and China imposing trade sanctions on the country. It even went to the extent of pressurizing the European businesses from trading with Lithuania. So this is how China uses trade as a coercive tool in its foreign policy. And the other one, as I already mentioned, weaponizing trade and China's global value chain advantages. As a punishing goal, trade coercion is perhaps best exemplified by Chinese actions against Australia. What happened was Australia's economic dependence on China was very striking because China was its largest export market and a source of imports. Especially in the aftermath of the COVID-19, what happened was Australia, asked for an independent probe into the origins of the COVID-19, which angered China, and Australia restricted major Australian exports such as barley, grain, beef, wine, sugar. In fact, they raised the tariff for barley. They banned the export of grains and beef. They initiated anti-dumping investigations against the Australian wine. It also informally instructed all the local business to defer buying coal from Australia. And the Chinese tourists were discouraged from traveling to Australia, and the Chinese students were encouraged to explore other study locations apart from Australia. So all these were because of, as I already mentioned, because of the Chinese, Australia's leading role in urging the WHO to conduct an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. So all these are latest in the series of similar behavior by China against trade partners with whom it has run into diplomatic disputes, which leaves very little doubt that China's intention to use trade as an action to achieve its political goals. Also, another reason for the global supply chain vulnerability is also because of the high sourcing, the dependencies and specialization which has taken place in the recent decades because of the scientific advancements. Because exponential growth has taken place in the use of high-tech items such as smartphones, tablets, and laptops. So, which has now increased the reliance on such supply chains on the source country for these products, in this case, which is China. And as we all know, China today, it dominates the various stages of production in these specific chains, and there is now mounting anxiety on several countries, for China weaponizing its economic control over its various supply chain networks. So, as a result of which, what happens is that, as I already mentioned, COVID-19 has accentuated such fear because of China enjoying such huge leverage in the strategic industries such as pharmaceuticals and critical minerals. And this coupled with China's tendency to resort to coercive tactics has now spurred a tendency for countries to diversify their sourcing and relocate supply chains substantially out of the mainland. So the weaponization of supply chain can be understood in the classic case study of the US-China conflict, which was called as termed war, but in actuality it was nothing but a technological supremacy war, because it was all surrounding the principles of techno-nationalism, which is tied to national security and economic progress. Basically, it was a race to dominate critical technologies and their global supply chains, which became inevitable in this regard. And as an outcome which was inevitable was that there was a felt need to retain control over critical technology supply chain in sectors like semiconductors, rare earth, telecommunication, pharmaceutical, which have a very significant bearing on the country's national security interest, including our nation's strategic influence on the world order. So all the countries, especially post-COVID, they started to diversify sourcing and building local capacities. And speaking of diversifying sourcing and building local capacity, thanks to Donald Trump, he was also the first one to mention that we need to start building local capacities, which he even brought out in one of his talks. So now we need to touch upon the concept of decoupling and where does actually China stand and hold its team. Despite all these talks of decoupling, global investors can hardly ignore the fast-growing the Chinese domestic market and its vast consumer base. Because especially in the post-pandemic world, we have just come out of lots of economic strain, shifting of companies across boundaries when business is already suffering from record low cash flow. It is very highly unlikely. So any drastic measures cannot be taken, will be avoided by businesses. And also one point is the overseas trade infrastructure in China, which is highly matured and it is also time tested, because unlike China, like countries like India and other Southeast Asian nations, excepting for Singapore, we do lack efficient and high capacity ports that can actually handle large container ships and direct marine liner services for connecting with major port. Either it has to take Singapore or Hong Kong, because otherwise it will take more time. So the feasibility is very low, at least in the near future, to immediately shift. And there are also certain political and social advantages that China offers, because there is no, there's a stable, the governmental transition is after 10 years, so there is a stable, favorable atmosphere there, and one-party rule, which also ensures companies are provided with relatively stable and investor-friendly policy framework. And also there is an abundant pool of skilled workers, along with the availability of matured and deep supply networks. Speaking of skilled workers, we have to understand there was a report which said that in 2019, today China produces more number of STEM graduates who are coming out of colleges every year, more than even the US. So despite all this, all the situation is not always rosy. China does face some series of challenges. One most important one being the population decline, which is because of the one-child policy which China had, and the onset of labor-saving technologies because of the onset of automation and robotics, and trade wars with the US and sanctions from other trade countries like Europe, which has increasing scrutiny is now being imposed on China, and also emergence of other ASEAN trade powers like Thailand and Vietnam. And all these have some of the factors that China today presently faces. And of course, there are distinct geopolitical features and ongoing multi-country effort to reorganize the supply chains through diversification strategies, which has become a notable outcome of thanks to the COVID-19. I would like to show you some of the measures taken and the lessons learned. So the basic lesson which we all learned was having a very well-greased and a resilient supply chain. That is not putting all your eggs in one basket. So creating a supply chain in such a way that it can withstand disruptions, be it man-made or natural, and which also ensures reliability for the global economy. And also supply chain politics, which China is very famous in practicing, so that man-made interruptions in supply chain, which are actually disruptive, are avoided. And it also showed how geopolitics and geoeconomics can never be truly separated. And just taking the case of India, especially the pandemic, because of the pandemic, the manufacturing sector took a huge hit. Several companies like automobile, electronics, and white goods sector faced a huge disruption. And speaking of hegemony over active pharmaceutical ingredients, despite India being one of the leader in pharmaceutical sector, but over reliance on API ingredients, close to I believe 80%, from China, which has created vulnerabilities in the supply chain for India. And of course, speaking of semiconductor, which is very significant, the tensions with China, led by the United States, led to imposing sanctions on export of microchips to China's biggest semiconductor manufacturer, which is SMIC. So a notable geopolitical urge was notable in reorganizing the global supply chain, which was also because of the techno-nationalism which was characterized by the US-China conflict, and especially the post-pandemic development, primarily China's deteriorating ties with several of the US allies, which has now led to a multi-country coalition to boost the resilience of strategic supply chain. So some of the initiatives have been, substantial amount of diplomatic efforts and capital has been invested today to boost the resilience of supply chains. Very notable one being the Quad, which is a quadrilateral dialogue between comprising Australia, India, Japan, and the US. And there is also one called the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, again, which by the Quad countries, namely the India, Japan, and Australia. And a very significant one being the G7 commitment to strengthen the supply chain, because what is very common between the Quad, SCRA, and the G7 is all the three initiatives, they share a very common anxiety over supply chain being weaponized to serve the security and strategic goals of one country. And next, what happened was other thread of common factors is they are also, directly aimed at neutralizing the influence that China today can exert on the supply chain. And the goal is very clear from the composition of all the countries. So, it all should not be based on one country's, or for example, China exploiting its economic clout for its geopolitical power projection. So as a result, it positions the supply chain as instruments of strategic influence, both by countries and their allies in their aim to control more and more of the critical supply chain. So in this way, this will become, geoeconomics becoming tools for geopolitical rivalry. And there is much emphasis on, governments coming forward to giving their support, which also resonates with the sentiments which was expressed by the SCRI, which was proposed by Japan, India, Australia, which is the Quad members in 20. In September 2020, what happened was it was also resonated in the April 2021 meet, where the SCRI tend to focus on automobile parts, petroleum, steel, textiles, financial services, and IT were given increased attention and concentration. And SCRI is also important because in the future, with the involvement of France, which can also depend on the European Union's position, it can also strengthen the SCRI. And interestingly, United Kingdom also has today shown much of interest in the SCRI mechanism. And during the G7 group of countries meeting in June 2021, also overall emphasis was placed on increasing the resilience of supply chain, particularly those involving critical technologies and materials, therefore making them less sensitive from geopolitical and security perspective. So seen through the prism of geopolitics, all the three, the G7, the Quad, the SCRI, they reflect an emerging pattern of global political order that is now taking shape around the supply chain. So all these are coalition of major democracies with open societies. So all the countries have significant technological capacities, both existing and emerging, and are very well positioned to host new supply chains. And these are also countries which are very like-minded. So next, I would like to touch upon the challenges and the way ahead. So the steady growth prospects of the Chinese economy, despite the pandemic, ensures that, at least for the foreseeable future, China will be important for high-tech supply chain, as countries will look to China for major market for consumption, particularly in products like lithium-ion, rechargeable batteries, and consumer electronics. So any drastic measures or immediate decoupling is not favored, because this is also, because to ensure that the just-in-time supplies are not choked and inventories are not exhausted, as it happened during the COVID-19. So reshoring production from mainland China to like-minded country will also depend on the amount of, the financial incentives that countries and the governments are willing to offer. Speaking of just taking three countries, Japan, Australia, and India, various policies were announced in this regard. For example, Japan announced subsidies to encourage companies to relocate to countries away from China. And in India, we have several, one among being the production links incentive scheme to expand local capabilities in several strategic industries. In the same way, Australia has also announced an economic package for a resilient supply chain and greater domestic manufacturing capabilities. So the challenge is going to be in the foreseeable future is to ensure that, all the dependencies from where we source the products are not on China, and so that even if it is on China, it doesn't constrain the reshoring of supply chain. So this is where the China plus one manufacturing strategy will come in handy. This could, generate opportunities for other Southeast Asian countries to have their business and manufacturing hubs getting relocated to their place.
Dr. Balasubramanian, last 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, sir. In the meantime, we cannot discount the exogenous geopolitical events. Say, for example, like the Afghanistan, the Taliban's capture of power in Afghanistan. As we already know, it has got easy ties with China, which offers Beijing an unprecedented opportunity to Afghanistan's untapped mineral resource, including lithium and rare earth. So we cannot discount the external geopolitical events having its influence on the strategic supply chain. So quickly coming on to my last slide with the concluding remarks, the present crisis of global supply chain can also prove to be a game changer for India's future, as it can turn India to a global hub of production and manufacturing hub. So the need of the hour is to ensure that India moves up the value chain, and alternate value chains are created with faster turnaround time. So for this, R&D is extremely important. We need more amount of GDP invested towards the R&D. We should also focus on indigenous technology, and the most important keyword here is look for alternative value chain and something creation of regional value chain, which we have to shift from global value chain to the regional value chain, which will definitely help better production related basis to work on, and especially mitigate risk from eventualities like the COVID-19 or any man-made or natural disasters. Perhaps I believe this is also where the seeds of Atmanirbharta lies here. At the end of the day, we have to ensure that we stand on our own foot. Once again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Balasubramanian, for completing in time. Now that all the panel members have made their presentations, first of all, compliments to each and every one of you for a very insightful presentation on your chosen topics. I have a couple of comments, though Dr. Balasubramanian touched upon it at the end. As a neighbor in which we have invested heavily, and I hope it's a long-term investment, that is what India proposed to do originally in 2000, our investments in Afghanistan have been missed out by the panel members. It has an indirect impact on the economic potential of China, because the Pakistanis are, as it is, in my opinion, a colony of China. They are no longer independent. Don't fall for the Shahbaz Sharif's government scrapping the CPEC or threatening to scrap the CPEC. Maybe the Chinese will douse him with a little more moolah, and that will be the end of such kind of protests coming from Pakistan. Pakistan economy is not independent. It is beholden and is controlled by the Chinese. So they are no longer an independent country. The original objective is access to the mineral wealth of Afghanistan. Afghanistan happens to be the rare earth elements capital, rather than the belt of rare earths available from Afghanistan and west and parts of Iran all the way up to Mongolia. The entire stretch, including Kazakhstan and parts of Central Asia, including China's western parts, all this is the rare earth elements belt in world geopolitics. And the Chinese have taken over once the Molycorp was closed in California because of environmental protests in the United States economy. The Chinese have taken over the manufacturing and production. For a long time, Japanese industries, which are specialists in miniature technologies, are dependent on the Chinese supply lines, which was disrupted, as General Krishnan had pointed out, in 2011. I remember it graphically because I was traveling to Utah and I saw this news item, and thereafter I happened to meet a physicist who worked with the State Department in Kansas State University. And this gentleman was saying that the rare earth elements are going to be the new element of conflict, because most conflicts originally in history have always been associated indirectly or directly with the availability of resources. Because of the influx of disruptive technologies, or Industry 4.0 that we call, most of them are useful in miniaturization of defense-related technologies, which General Krishnan has pointed out. And the Hajika copper mines and the other areas which China is slowly and regularly trying to take over from the Afghans, who are not anywhere near those technologies utilization, or in terms of economic development, anywhere close to competing with anybody else. The Pakistanis have exploited them. Now, looking at the Pakistanis, the Chinese are exploiting the Afghans, and Afghans, I hope, wake up to the reality of their presiding over huge deposits and how the neighbors are taking. And I'm very glad to see in the news that the Taliban regime is not so very beholden to Pakistanis, but they are trying to protect about the Durand Lines violations every now and then, or as frequently as possible, by the Pakistanis. Now, coming back to China and Chinese economy, the economy has varied projections, and we are in the era of, unfortunately, I have to use this term, fake news. Unless until we have an analyst speaking with the understanding of Mandarin and is not dependent on either a CIA fact book or a Oxford University presentation, we have very little authentic, credible information coming out of China. They're also past masters at cyber warfare, which means they are capable of planting disinformation and misinformation in the public domain. So one has to read between the lines every now and then, or too very often, to arrive at conclusions. So the Chinese economy's projections, Chinese economy's vulnerabilities, the Chinese economic capabilities that can dominate the entire globe and compete with the Americans, and in the process, what is its impact on countries like India and the little fellows who have taken debts from the Chinese. One other issue that economic analysts need to talk about is the absence of China from the Paris Club. For those of you who are not aware of the Paris Club is that club which takes care of the debt mounting in certain of the countries as an addendum to IMF and World Bank. Now, this is an arrangement of the European Union members, because predominantly the creditors of the Paris Club are from the European continent, in addition to United States across the Atlantic. Now, China has refused to join. China is not a member, and China cannot be punished for its actions against those who default on its debts. We need to see how the Sri Lankan case is going to pan out in the next few months, and look at Nepal, which is, if not today and tomorrow, certainly the next target day after. The Chinese have done at the diplomatic level a great deal of damage both to Pakistan and to Nepal, and we are at the receiving end. For us, the domain of operations appears to be the maritime domain, because in economics or in supply chains or in resource mobilization, we are not yet there. We have the ambition, but the distance and the time that India takes to travel from the drawing board to the actual project execution and completion. We have a huge gap in these aspects, which because of the nature of the political system in China, the Chinese have been able to bridge. That is why it is a capitalism with an iron hand. It's not the democratic, liberal, or libertarian, if I may use the term, democracy of the American or the European variety. Given these issues, we need to wait and watch China's reaction, because in every likelihood, a country that is after the resources of the world, not just the Asiatic region, one has to look at how China is likely to recover its debts. Is it likely to recover it financially, or is it likely to, as I mentioned earlier, swap it with the sovereign authority over nation states? You're not able to pay. The corrupt politicians of the world are happy. But the commoners of different small countries cannot live happily because, first of all, they don't have the understanding of what the Chinese are doing. Second, it is the responsibility of analysts and academics and experts to bring out the nitty-gritty details from a multiplicity of perspectives when one is talking about economics related to the Chinese economy. So with these few remarks, I request the panelists to take their questions. I see from the chat box there are questions for Professor Nagy, which he has answered, and he requested to exit early because of some commitment probably. And I think the next question is to General Krishnan, sir. As for developed countries in rare earths, Canada and Australia are major suppliers as of now. Even the UK is getting involved. Should India cooperate with them and invoke Commonwealth links, is the question from Rishi Atreya. There's another related question, I think. We have a problem with rare metals and how do you think we should go forward? The objection, if I may take 1 minute, General Krishnan, the objection is from the environmental lobby because they pollute the atmosphere. Those industries that extract rare earths from the earth, they pollute the environment phenomenally. This is one of the reasons why way back in 1940s, the Molycorp was compelled to close down the California segment. But then the Americans are very quiet and very unassuming when it comes to their national interest. And they have been prospecting elsewhere outside their country and taking it from Africa and other countries. And I suspect even from Afghanistan, because they were there for long years. And before them, the Russians have attempted that. And now the Chinese are onto it. So I don't think in India, it's to the extent my knowledge goes, Orissa is the coast where it is available. And those coastal states have to be, environmentally protected. And that is the tussle between Government of India. Mishra Dhatu Nigam Mithani is looking at these issues for your information. The floor is open to General Krishnan.
I think, the rare earths problem, having studied rare earths in quite a bit of detail, let me say that it isn't an insurmountable problem. Yes, China has the largest resource, as I showed, 35% of the global deposits are with them. And about 60% as on today, today's rare earth production is with them. And the major problem with the why Molycorp was closed down was because of the environmental issue. I brought out, the 850 gallons per minute. That was the waste tailing that was being discharged by the mine. And the tailing contained radioactive thorium and uranium. But now, it is not that the Chinese didn't have these problems. And like I had pointed out again when I was speaking, the Chinese definitely to reach a point where they can get monopoly, they did overlook all these issues. They subsidized the production and they were selling rare earths at such cheap rates, everybody else had to close down. And again, the mountaintop mine is being revived. And there are Australia is in a big way onto the downstream technology. So is Japanese, and I showed the world has woken up. And but unfortunately, when you say world, it's basically the European countries, Australia, Canada, US, and Japan. Japan is already there. India is not part of it. Now, that was the, biggest problem which concerns us. And it isn't that India doesn't have India's reserves, that 6% deposit is adequate to meet all our requirements. That is one. Second is, the India probably has the shortest gestation period. We have the capability to produce rare earth permanent magnets within just about 2 to 3 years. And if you recollect, I also mentioned that one of the permanent magnet, rare earth permanent magnet, which is the main product of rare earth, which has application across the board, whether it is in missile, in spacecraft, or in aircraft, or in ships, or in electric vehicles. The company with which UK has started the facility to produce rare earth permanent magnets is LCM London, the less common metals. There's a story behind that. I think at the cost of taking a couple of minutes, let me tell you, that company was bought up by an Indian. It is not so much the Orissa coast as you had mentioned. It is more to do with a little south. It is the Tamil Nadu coast which has a lot of it. And this particular company which bought up that LCM, the idea was India would open up its monazite mining, beach sand mineral mining, to private players. And the moment that is done, they will shift the facility to India and start producing rare earths here, rare earth permanent magnet and rare earth products. Unfortunately, the last 5 to 7 years, though a great deal of good has been done in the mining sector per se, not just rare earth, mining sector has, maybe because of the apprehensions that the government had for the previous, the government prior to 2014, the mining sector is actually lying dormant. India has not exploited its mineral wealth, let alone rare earth. It is applicable across the board, and rare earth is one of them. Now, the beach sand minerals, let me go one more step ahead. Prior to about 3-4 years back, beach sand minerals, they were private players permitted to do some mining in beach sand mineral for heavy minerals like garnet and rutile, and they were required to store the remaining byproducts which contained uranium and rare earth, thorium and rare earth, in specified concrete tanks which are actually existing. There's a huge close to maybe 60,000-70,000 tons of this byproduct lying in tanks in this Tamil Nadu and Andhra coast, which actually is a ready-made resource available with already heavy minerals taken out of it. But it is not that the Indian government or a country has just ignored it. It has problem, because when you from this stored byproduct in the concrete tanks, if you extract rare earths, what remains will also, it contains thorium, and dealing with thorium we are still not very sure, and that is the major inhibition. So as on today, beach sand minerals is categorized as atomic mineral. It can be mined only by PSU, by the Indian Rare Earth Limited. So there is such a lot of frustration among the Indian private players with respect to beach sand minerals and rare earths. And it is, we are there, but not there. We have the capability, but somehow it just requires a little bit of tweaking of policy. And all these players, whether it is Japanese or Australians or UK or US, they are all very keen with finances and technology. I am aware of a lot of them because I interact with a lot of miners to set up facilities in India. It just requires some policy. Sorry, it was a long-winded one, but I had to make the point.
Thank you very much for your intervention, sir. Now, there is one question to all the speakers, except for the RCEP, which Japan and China are members, and Japan and China, South Korea, FTA, which is still under negotiation. What are the other ways that Japan can maximize economic benefits from China, despite China's economic coercion? Can the speakers help me answer this question? Is from Lin Ha. Professor Parulekar, would you like to take it?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chairperson. So let's look at it this way. There's no doubt that the fundamentals work against Japan because it's a disproportionate asymmetrical relationship with China. But the manner in which Japan can extract gains from the relationship with China is to leverage the candidature prospect of China in the CPTPP. China seems to be very keen to enter it because there has been strong rumors afloat that the Americans have been pushing the idea of getting Taiwan into the CPTPP. If that happens, then that obviously throws a wrench into the whole trade architecture in the region. The Chinese are pushing behind the scenes various other countries. Japan can hold out on that and can obviously be able to maximize certain gains. But the point is, this is not a region where an overarching bulwark coalition can work. The Indo-Pacific is the region where multilateral and sub-regional groupings actually deliver the maximum gains. The Japanese have 4 or 5 areas where they can actually harness their core competencies in competition with China to be able to get China to be conciliatory towards them economically. The first thing is the Japanese push into Southeast Asia. The point was mentioned even in the earlier session where we saw that significantly both Prime Minister Suga and now Prime Minister Kishida and even Prime Minister Abe, they have made Southeast Asia, particularly the ASEAN bloc of countries, as a very significant, important player for the Japanese. And the Japanese investment in this region outpaces China quite handily. In fact, China has lost quite a few contracts to the Japanese on the infrastructure sector within ASEAN. The second is the India-China, relationship, the India-Japan relationship, which can work in certain theaters. The first theater, obviously, is the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. The very fact that Japan now is very much part of our development plans of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, that certainly gets the Chinese, rattled. Because in terms of a larger game plan, it does build into potential India, Japan, Indonesia, trilateral, etc. The third is deep underwater sea cables. Again, that's where the competition between Japan and China is going to be really rife. Now, if Japan plays its coalitions well in terms of teaming up with Australia, with India, with Indonesia, with the United States, it actually becomes quite a strong bulwark in a very tactical sense. And that gets the Chinese then to basically engage the Japanese in a mutually beneficial dialogue. Let's remember one thing, that in 2015, after holding out for many years because of the Yasukuni shrine visits that Shinzo Abe used to make, and Xi Jinping was very clear he would not talk to him, he would not meet him, all of a sudden the Chinese changed tack. And the reason the Chinese changed tack was because they realized that the pivot to Asia that Obama had declared was one that the Americans wanted to use in terms of building a kind of a hard coalition in the East China Sea. And so all of a sudden they opened up, channels with Shinzo Abe. And in fact, they talked about how there could be technology cooperation in high-tech areas between Japan and China. China believes that Japan will be enticed by the large market that China offers for Japanese companies. But Japan is also quite knowledgeable and sentient of the fact that when they enter the Chinese market, given there's no level playing field between firms, private and SOE, it will essentially end up in terms of technological, pilferage and espionage. So Japan will have to play tactical alliances very smartly. Of course, it has to repair its relationship with South Korea, which right now has been in the docks for quite a while, and that kind of stalls the FTA that has to happen. But if it plays its coalitions well in this part of the world, then that will bring China to the table in terms of a mutually beneficial dialogue with Tokyo. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned the underwater sea cables. That is the next big security challenge, because if anybody wants to scuttle anybody's information flow, that is where the security challenge exists under the sea. And the protective mechanisms for that are, well, the less said, the better for majority of the country. So somebody holds the key to the transfer of information from one end of the globe to the other. There's a question to Dr. Balasubramanian. So what do you think about India's initiative about the Kaladan trilateral project in Burma, Myanmar, and an initiative in Sri Lankan East Container Terminal? Do you think these initiatives can be alternatives to the China's supply chain? Dr. Bala?
Ma'am, I think he's not there. He had some internet connection, so I cannot see him.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is anybody else willing to take on this question? Look, if I may interject, the Indians do not have the kind of deep pockets that China has. You see, the global liberalization processes in the region of Asia, it begins with China way back in 74, 75, post-Mao era, Deng Xiaoping's era. And then it is Sri Lanka in 78, and then comes India in 91. And in the interim, the experiences of Southeast Asian countries was a game changer for liberalization of economies. And certain of the countries were very, very skeptical about its opening of markets and the entire process that goes alongside the liberalization and globalization of markets. Now, having said that, we don't have the kind of deep pockets that China comes to with interventions in any of the major or mega projects. The Chinese have a huge, huge installed capacity for infrastructure development. And having developed their own little pockets inside the country, now they don't want to allow it to go wasted. So they want places where they can intervene and utilize that capabilities of infrastructure development, and hence they are coming up with, BRI, CPEC, whatever name you want to give it. If the countries are willing to become subservient to China and go in for these very attractive packages, not knowing what is in store for them at a future date, because it is not just construction and delivery to a given government. It is the ability of the governments to carry on the projects beyond a certain point. The vulnerability aspect is being missed out. The Chinese are benefiting by coming up with these proposals, and few countries have taken over the offers. And we need to look at little countries like Samoa, Vanuatu, now Sri Lanka in the neighborhood, and other countries and their economies and the impact of Chinese construction projects on those economies. That's what I have to say. If the other panelists have anything to supplant, they're welcome.
Yeah, can I just add something?
Please.
When we say I think the question with respect to, do you think these initiatives can be alternative to China's supply chain? I think very well brought out, really not so. Because if you need a supply chain, you got to have something to put through the chain. Chinese have a lot to put through the chain, therefore they need a supply chain. They need, and these ports that they look for, whether it is Gwadar or in Myanmar, are to get out of the the Malacca Strait problem that they have, constraint.
Malacca dilemma.
Yes, they need to get into the waters without having to pass through the constraint. And Gwadar, whether we like it or not, is an excellent outlet. So is he getting it out through Myanmar. Now, for us, Kaladan is more important for firstly our own Northeast, and also for reaching out to the Southeast Asian countries as a part of our Look East policy. Certainly, it's going to help us in a big way, but it in no way is countering anything of Chinese, nor is it to compete with them in the real in that perspective of the question that you asked. Thank you.
Dr. Parulekar, anything?
Yes, so let me just take this question as well. Look, when we talk of supply chains, as the other two speakers have said, it's a complex web of industrial heft. And you have to have core competency in terms of industrial power at manufacturing, but you also need the connectivity network, you also need the logistical supplies. And at the end of the day, how are you going to build an alternative to China's supply chain when Chinese exports, even in the post-COVID era or the COVID wake era, to countries in its neighborhood has actually gone up? So while we keep, peddling this narrative of a China plus one and, people looking to evacuate from China, the narrative is being built on one level, but the data doesn't support the facts. Even in Japan, when companies were asked about what they want to do with China's supply chains, more than 90% of companies from Japan who were in China said, we are not looking to exit China. Vietnam, which remains such a big player in terms of trying to keep China at bay, has in recent times mellowed down on its South China Sea dispute with China, essentially because it stands to be the biggest beneficiary of relocation of units from China because of rising cost of production. And Vietnam realizes they're the biggest beneficiary. So none of the ASEAN countries want to walk out. And I can say this, with a degree of certainty. When the SCRI was formed, it was with a lot of fanfare. Sometime back, Japan proposed that we should bring in ASEAN into the SCRI, so that India, Japan, Australia, and ASEAN countries would make at least some optical difference, if not anything else. And India was very clear to say, no, we don't want the ASEAN countries in, because we know very clearly that for all the talk about India-ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN countries individually and collectively prioritize China, because their trade, investment links, their demographic links are disproportionately higher with China. So, and plus, given the fact what's happened in Myanmar right now with the, with the landscape, what's happened to democracy, the military junta, very close to China, I think to expect, something in terms of an alternative supply chain might be a pitch too far. I think what we should basically look at is what I call as self-preservation in our neighborhood. We had Dr. Jaishankar yesterday in Bangladesh, and the big takeaway for India essentially was that we were able to get access to Chittagong port to be able to access the Northeast. So, these kind of small time things kind of become big takeaways for us, because in our neighborhood, we have to acknowledge, particularly in the BIMSTEC area, China's connectivity, China's heft, China's financial pelf becomes much too difficult to be able to keep at bay.
I appreciate all these responses to the audience's questions. Thank you very much to each and all the panelists. I request the Indic Researchers Forum to say goodbye to all of us, and I thank them once again for inviting me to chair, and I enjoyed the presentations of all the panelists, and thank you for a wonderful session.
I would like to thank the session chair, Jyotsna ma'am, for amazingly moderating this session, and all the speakers for such an enlightening study of the Chinese economy. I request all of the participants to please stay tuned for our upcoming sessions tomorrow. Please join in. Thank you.